Good afternoon. My name is Hanina Ben Menachem from Hebrew University, and I am delighted to chair this session. I'm very grateful for the organizers of the conference that have invited me to chair this session. And I'm delighted to chair this session not only because of the very distinguished speakers that we have, but because I think that jurisprudential analysis is the main approach, in my view, the best approach to discuss Jewish law. So I'm very happy to be here with you. And we have 4 speakers. We have 90 minutes divided by 4 is 22 minutes for each speaker. So you are invited to speak for about 15 minutes. And I'll let you know when time's up. I trust you. So do I have to, of course, Michael Bari, Professor Michael Bari.
No, not yet.
Not yet.
With your blessing. With your
My
blessing.
blessing, yeah.
כמו אקוויטי, הולך לעתיד.
He's coming to us from the שערי משפט Academic Center, and I'm delighted to have him as the first speaker. Well, I have known Michael Bari's for many years, and I'm always enjoy very much to listen to you and to read what you have to say.
Thank you very much. To get that kind of approbation from Hanina is worth the whole thing. I can go home now.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Hanina is, in a sense, a prima causa because not only was he my mentor, one of my 2 mentors in my PhD, but also my mentor for the master's, and for a short period, I was his research assistant, if you remember, too. It was an interesting period. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming. The topic on causation, I think, is important, especially for a conference that talks about technology. What happens in many of the rabbinic responses that have to do with activation, with human action, is that it breaks down into a microsystem of analysis of human action, theory of action. When we talk about direct causation, indirect causation, gurama, garmei, and these are concepts that are broken down almost into like a pseudo, I call it a pseudo-scientific mechanism whereby any kind of indirect action, whether it's a timer, whether it's some kind of a random mechanism, it's almost as if we can do anything we want to. I know there's been a discussion, I even saw the movies of the evening, the discussion that they had on a recent Supreme Court decision this past February, this past Shvat, on the question of causation with car racing, with dangerous car racing in Yerushalayim. I'm not going into the field of the name it for short of capital punishment. I think there's a whole policy system there that, in a sense, minimizes the talk of causation. I think the rationale there would be that the Torah is reticent to give human mandate to taking other people's lives. So the concept of causation with regard to capital punishment is very, very limited, very strict. I'd like to talk about liability, mostly in negligence, liability in tort, but to apply it to 2 aspects. One is the theological aspect. I think there's a deep religious significance to talk the theory of causation, and I think that we have to think afresh of some of the topics, some of the applications that we'll find later on in this conference that have to do with halacha and technology are typically having to do with indirect causation. So first, set out 3 interpretive strategies among the medieval commentaries and among the decisives afterwards, the authorities, the posting afterwards, that incorporate the various interpretive strategies into their writings. There are lists in the Talmud. There are whole lists of actions that are either considered liable or not liable in a seemingly contradictory fashion. Indirect causation. There are lists of them, and there are 3 interpretive strategies. I call it 201. One strategy is to talk about reconciliation, or 102. In a sense, breaking it down to different types of indirect causation with degrees of connectivity, where Rama is considered not liable, and Rameh or Garmeh as a different form of indirect causation, which is considered liable, is considered close enough, proximate enough to the actor, the link between the actor and the result, as clear enough, as direct enough, and anyone who wants any the presentation afterwards is welcome to get it. I don't have to worry about it. So the prime consideration would be foreseeability, but there are other, I'd say, breaking factors too. Third-party intervention, time delay, and we find different formulations in the Rishonim and medieval commentaries. It starts with Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre, the Ri HaZaken, the editor of the Tosfot. Nachmanides has a favorite interpretation. Less well known is Rabbi Ephraim of Regensburg, who was a manuscript on Grame Dina de Garam, was published several years ago, who really reduces the whole thing to the concept of foreseeability. That's one strategy. Another strategy is to say, well, zero. It's not like this uniform system in the Talmud. The Talmud bases itself on the premise that indirect causation is something which does not create liability, and there are exceptions. And the exceptions are, in a realistic sense, all questions of policy, ad hoc. This case, that case, this policy, the other policy, and that leaves open for debate the question of whether the exceptions are an open list or a closed list, whether we can apply that kind of an idea of an open-faced intercourse with policy considerations, whether we can apply that nowadays. You can assume that halacha, being lowercase conservative, will be more formalistic and less apt to using policy considerations. But I'd like to focus on the third approach. And the third approach is that of Maimonides, although he's not alone with that. Rashi is famous for this, the Alfasi, and Maimonides is always going to go into contention, but there's no doubt in my mind that Maimonides recognizes the lists as conflicting, and that a decision has been made in the Talmud to accept indirect causation as creating liability at Torah. That's the bottom line. I'm not alone with this. Shatta Cohen Shach, the Gaon in Vilna, and we'll see some of the text in a second. And I'd like to focus not on the pivot case, the whole list, but there's a pivot case, there's a decision made in the Talmud, where the Rafram, the Gemara says, Achbe Rafram le Rav Ashi, the Achbe Agbe Kishurat Betzalma, which means either that Rafram held Rav Ashi personally liable for a case where he inflicted indirect causation, or, this is Ramban's interpretation, the medieval Ashkenazi commentaries, where Rafram overruled a case that Rav Ashi held was not liable, and this was Rav Ashi's own personal opinion that indirect causation is something that does not create liability. Rafram overruled Rav Ashi in this particular case. That's the pivot case. There's a whole list. It can go either way, and the Talmud takes it to liability. What I'd like to claim, though, is that for Maimonides, there's not only a question of technical question, interpretive question of where the Talmud goes, but Maimonides is injecting his own Maimonidean theory of causation that he gets directly from Aristotle. He quotes Aristotle in the Guide, or Al-Farabi, even Rouge, people that you read later on. Now, what I'd like to do is not to stick with I'd like to point out some of the Aristotelian characteristics of Maimonides' theory of causation. What I'd like to do later, at the bottom line, depending on the 22 minutes and how fast the sand goes through the hourglass, but to bring it up to date, to show that there's an applicability here, the theory of causation that we're more familiar with, post-Jungian, post-Kantian theories of causation that have a central function for human awareness. Foreseeability is not just a legal question for Maimonides, it's a question of theory of action. It's what glues together action and results, which is why foreseeability, awareness, cognizance of results is critical. Otherwise, we break down into some kind of a Jungian skepticism. Our awareness of what's going to happen, whether it's the actor or the bystander, is what glues together these discrete moments, which is why I think there's a central position, a central function that awareness has which of course is the basis for rules of foreseeability, which create liability of tort, but they have implications for halacha later on too. So let's have a look here. The Talmud in Bava Kama 68 says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis teach that in the case where someone fanned the flame along with the wind, one is only liable if the human action alone was the cause, was sufficient. But in a case where it's indirect causation, in a case where the wind is a necessary component in creating the dangerous flame, liba v'libato haruach, Rav Ashi is the bottom line there. We mentioned Rav Ashi before says, grama be'al mahu. And I mentioned the term grama, that's a technical term here. Grama, that's mere. Grama be'alma is just mere indirect causation, which is not a ground for liability. When the Rambam codifies this particular halacha, he paraphrases it. He goes out of his way to paraphrase the Talmudic language. And it says, liba v'libato haruach chayav shaharehu garam. Garam, he created, he caused it. The grama turns into garam. V'chol hagorem lehazik, this is a generalization, like a general term. Instead of saying grama be'alma, but kol agrava be'alma, grama be'nezikin patul, the rule is that indirect causation in tort is something that's not liable. The Rambam paraphrases that generalization and says, kol hagorem lehazik mishalem nezik shalem kishal kol hamazikim. Paraphrasing and flipping it around. So, indirect causation is liable according to Rambam, and he reiterates that several places in his writings. But kol hagorem lehazik lamon chavero kishal kol hamazikim אף על פי שאינו הוא המזיק זה הנזק עצמו באחרונה, הואיל והוא הגורם הראשון חייב. Rambam says here someone who indirectly inflicts damage, even if he's not the last station in the line, he's not the last one, he's not the immediate cause, as long as he's the first cause. I have 5 minutes, so okay, we'll go quickly. Now the idea of first mover, first cause, in the guide is typically mentioned about God. Of course, we know that prima causa God, but the Rambam also talks about first causes that are not first in line. It's the sphere who's the first cause. And the Rambam has a whole chain of events where the sphere causes the weather, and I'm chilly, and I have an idea to move something, and it breaks down into, it breaks down the whole thing of movement. So I finally block that, the breeze that's coming through the cracks in the wall of the door, which is considered a final cause. Final cause in the sense it's a teleological cause, it's why I'm doing something. And the Rambam talks about, okay, if there's constant movement, then that first cause has to have something before him, that's his proof of God. But the idea of a first cause who's not God is there. And that's true of the soul. If I have an idea, I want something done, that's the cause of the action. It's true of Joseph, for instance, in the biblical story. His success in the house of Potiphar was the first cause of everything else that happened. Now, this is an important halacha because it uses the concept of first cause when we talk about someone who throws a vessel from a rooftop. And when he throws it from a rooftop, there happen to be cushions blocking the trajectories that something won't break. Someone takes away these cushions. A is still responsible against the grain of most medieval commentaries in the text. Says the Rambam, why is he? Because he is the first cause. He is the arranger. He set it up. He set up this action. And because he set the motion, he set things into motion, okay, the second one is also liable. The second one is grama, that's indirect causation. But even throwing something against the wall, and there are cushions in the wall, and at the time of the action, there was nothing, but I set it up, I set it into motion. And this goes on in the guide itself, with all the texts that I'll send you, whoever wants it. But God, basically what I'm saying is theologically, according to the Rambam, God sets up the world even if things happen afterwards through his agents, through angels, through human will, through human free will. He sets up Nebuchadnezzar to destroy Jerusalem. Now, he didn't reveal himself to Nebuchadnezzar. And that's part of his tenets, that he can't be a prophet because Nebuchadnezzar's a wicked person. But I set it up, I got him moving, I got it done. And if there's indirect causation, it's still God doing it. When he talks about general providence for all the creatures in the world, even those who aren't human, even those who aren't free will, he sets it up. I set it in motion. This is my action. And even if in the chain of causation there's someone with free will, it's still my action because I set it up. The providence is, even let's say the archetypical scripture for direct providence, God opens his hands, gives everyone their own providence, whatever they need, there's sufficient, whatever they need to satisfy their needs. Rambam said that has nothing to do with direct providence. I set it up and set it in motion, it's my doing. So his theology and his causation have to do with his concept of first cause, which is why he interprets that particular case of throwing the vessel from on the cushions. But he set it in motion, he's responsible. Now I'd like to finish with, I'll skip. Rambam talks about causes, mentioned Aristotle's causes. Aristotle talks about 4 different causes, and not all of them are causes in the modern sense. A cause in the Aristotelian sense is really an answer to the question of why or how. It's an explanation. Sometimes we look at these things ex post facto, things that don't have to be necessarily foreseeable in advance, might be a question of moral responsibility ex post facto. It didn't have to happen, but after it happened, I can explain that it's my fault. So there may not be direct, foreseeable, analytic, something that, a causation that could create liability in a legal sense, but it could create responsibility in a moral sense, and this is what Rambam would paraphrase as saying, Chayav bidei shemayim, at heaven's hand. And I know I have a minute left. 3 minutes. Let's talk about the last 2 more things. Rambam talks about an arbitrator who forced himself on the parties. And he's considered liable. Why? Kedin gorem. Kedin kol gorem lehazik sheze nitkaven lehaziku. There's an intention. And intention is a component, a central component in indirect causation. The fact that I was aware of the fact that I'm not a proper judge, I forced myself in the parties, is an indirect case of causation. The actual damage could be someone else who fled the country, who threw whatever it was, threw it out into the garbage, gave the money to the other party, and the party went off with the money. So I was just an indirect cause. But my willfulness, or even the fact that I wasn't careful enough when I gave my judgment, sticks, like it glues the results to my initial negligence. And I'd like to explain that. How does it work? Why does it work that way? I think that when we talk about a unit, and this is especially important when we talk about halakha, when we talk about a unit, it's the question of, take Hume's criticism of critique of causation. We don't see the causation. We see event A, we see event B. It's something that happens in our minds that connects A to B. And Kant takes that later on and turns this into something of an apperception, something like a synthetic a priori, which turns into the way we look at the world. So what we see is really what glues the results to the beginning. So if we can foresee it legally, we can say that from a legal perspective, the results are part of our action. They're part of the potential of our action. That, in a sense, is not just a question of legal causation. It's the whole concept of causation is a normative concept, which really depends on how we look at the world, how we see things. What happens when we talk, not in a legal sense, but in a halakhic sense? Something that I can foresee, and there's no random element. This is my last point. There's no random element, but I can foresee it. Let's talk about all kinds of grama, the indirect causations, mechanisms. Talk about grama mechanisms for Shabbat, for Chag. People ride all kinds of carts, but they know what the result will be. What happens, let's take a Rambam, his interpretation of what happens when someone draws oil from a burning lamp. Rambam changed his mind, debated the issue with himself, and actually changed his mind. In the initial commentary to the Mishnah, Rambam says that someone who takes oil from a burning lamp is really only causing indirect is indirectly extinguishing the flame. Because the flame would have burned out, let's say, in an hour, and now I made it 20 minutes from now. I made it 20 minutes less, or whatever it is. Indirectly, I caused the extinguishing of the flame. Rambam changes his mind. In the later editions of his commentary, he erases that sentence. And instead, he puts in, because it's considered actually extinguishing the flame. If it's one particular unit with a foreseen result, there's no way out of it. You can see the result, there's no way out of it. Someone sits on that automatic kalnoit for Shabbat, whatever it is, he's not going to stay there till Monday. You know that within the next 20 minutes he'll be off and riding. So let me leave with a question mark at the end. When we use indirect causation in halachic concepts, are we fair with ourselves? Are we playing a fair game? Because we know the results. Is it really indirect? Can we break things down into the micro system of indirect causation? Or do we have to look at the foreseeability in order to make it legitimate? Thank you.
אסור וחייב זה אותו דבר.
מה זה?
אסור וחייב זה לא אותו דבר.
אולי זה גם חייב. אתה יודע תוצאה? לא ברור שאתה לא מכוון ממש.
כן, אבל לא כתוב ברמב"ם שהוא חייב מיתה.
מה זה?
לא חייב, כתוב אסור, זה אסור.
זה משנה מפורשת, מסתפק בנר חייב. מסתפק מן השמן שבנר חייב, המשנה אומרת.
כן, זה ברור, אבל מדברים על הרמב"ם, על הסיבתיות אצל הרמב"ם.
Do you really think the Rambam has a unified definition of grama for Shabbat and Nezikin? Is that what you're proposing?
I'm saying that foreseeability for Shabbat, possibly. He isn't explicit with Shabbat.
He's not at all. I mean, on the contrary, but the Rambam is totally not explicit.
But the fact that he changed his mind means that he's debating with himself. And the question
from the Rambam's Parish and the Mishnayos?
Yes.
Oh.
The fact that, no, I'm sorry. The fact that the Rambam changes his mind and keeps editing, at least 3 editions going for Kakos.
Right.
Okay, the 3 editions, he's playing with it. So he starts off in his youth saying that, okay, it's grammar, this is indirect causation. Then he says, wait a second, it's foreseeable. And if it's foreseeable, then the results are glued onto the action.
And in the Mishnah Torah?
That's the second version. If you see the results and it's there, then the intent is there. I'd say that he'd go for that kind of a theory of causation.
Vis-a-vis Shabbat as well. Meaning you think the Rambam has a unified theory of grama for Shabbat in the Mishnah Torah?
Possibly, he's not explicit. Go back to Torah, but I think at least the question, okay?
Okay.
At least to raise the question, Shabbat I think is legitimate.
I don't know if there's no action, it's just foreseeability. So if I have a machine-grade interface, somebody can actually do an action with thinking.
Are you brain?
Yeah.
I don't know whether the Rambam talks about in the guide talks about the soul as something that creates a chain of causation. Someone's soul, that he's chilly, he wants it to be done, he wants the weather to change, or someone's a desire creates a chain of causation. Now, whether that counts as action in Shabbat or in Torah, I doubt that. Okay? Even
so, one of the new technologies that's on the field, so you have somebody who had a stroke and they're quadriplegic, and now I can connect.
Don't know. But that's not what Rambam's talking about. Rambam's talking about if I do have an action, what I would think.
No, I'm asking the question.
I don't know. Possibly, because according to Rambam, that sets into motion change. The concept of action, of movement, the Aristotelian concept of movement is change, is motion. But motion means change. Now, it doesn't have to be change in place. There can be change in transformation.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next speaker is Professor